This video we're going to talk about the Django template language. I love this language. I'll tell you, it is so easy to learn and it is so very helpful. It's really going to improve your web pages and it really gives you a lot of control about how things are printed out. They look very professional and they look much more, modern, sophisticated. I mean, it just really is a great language. The Django template language is a scripting language that mimics Python syntax. It is not Python technically. There are some differences. But the designers of Django purposely made it consistent with Python because they didn't want you to have to learn another language. So it is very similar to Python. It can only be used, DTL can only be used within Django HTML templates. You can't use it like Java or Python and for analytics and things like that. It's just a very simple language. It's really a scripting language, not a full-fledged language, but it really does help, and you'll see how it can be used in just a few minutes. To differentiate HTML from DTL, I mean, a web page has to be able to tell what is HTML, what do you really want to display on the page, and what is the script. So it has to use some kind of funky symbols to make sure that it can determine which one is which. So if you're using DTL and it doesn't appear correctly, double check the syntax. Make sure you haven't embedded a space somewhere that you aren't supposed to, or if you were supposed to put a space in and you didn't, make sure it is exactly correct because it can be very sensitive in the syntax. So along that line, first of all, DTL should not be used for complex logic or algorithms. It's just simply a very lightweight scripting language that helps you display things in kind of a really cool modern way. DTL variables here are in the format of variable surrounded by two curly braces, and you'll notice the space on either side of it. This is something that does tend to be a challenge sometimes when I teach this class because students don't want to put that space in. I think it works without the spaces, but you know what? This is a programming convention. And that is when you go to use a language, you should adopt the programming conventions that are in place. Here's the problem. If you don't do that, it looks like you don't know what you're doing. And it also looks like I didn't teach you right, and I don't want that to happen. So if you're doing a job interview, make sure you're doing this. If they ask you to do something with Django, make sure you're using this approach. If you get hired in a company or you're doing a senior project, make sure you put those spaces in. It seems like it's a minor thing, but when other people are using your code and having to debug your code, it really makes it difficult for them to understand your code if you don't do that. Small thing, I know, but it has big implications. So how do templates get data? I mean, what actually makes a web page dynamic is, believe it or not, the Django template language. That's what makes a page dynamic and change every time the database changes. It's really cool. So the data have to be sent to the template, and we're going to use this method called render. And I believe you've seen it a couple of times. We haven't really gone into it in too much depth, but now we're going to dive in. The render method it does a lot. It takes a designated HTML file, that is a template, and it combines it with the original request along with what data you want to actually send to it. And it combines them two and generates a dynamic HTML page. It's really cool. Now, early in the semester, I mentioned to you that every Django view must return an HTTP response object. Now, when we start using render, it looks like it isn't doing that anymore because we're not going to use HTTP response anymore, but technically it is. Render does return an HTTP response object. It just does a lot more too. So render is it's a shortcut. It makes things a lot simpler. It actually reduces the number of lines of code and it makes your code a lot easier to understand. So we're going to be embracing render and using it from now on. You won't be using HTTP response anymore, but just know that you are still returning an HTTP response object. So here's an example. Suppose we have this thing called getProduct. And in the first line of the method here, we're going to go out to the product table and we're going to get an object, a product object, and it's going to be the product object that has an ID of 1. So we're going to get a single product from the product table. In the next line, we're going to load up a dictionary. And you'll notice the curly braces. That is Python syntax to create a dictionary. You may remember that from 225. And in every dictionary, you have two parts. Okay, you have a key and you have a value. The render method, you have to tell the render method what the template is as well as the data. The first element is the original request. So you have the original request, you have the HTML template, which in this case is product.html, and you have the data. That's what you have to specify to create a dynamic web page. In the data dictionary, there is this thing called item, and there is something called product. Item is the key, product is the value. Product is actually what is being sent to the web page. Now here's the important thing. You'll notice we call the dictionary data. You can never refer to data in the HTML template. The template does not know what data is. It just knows what the content of data is. That is a really important differentiation. You must refer in this case to to the item that is in the actual data dictionary. You must refer to it as item. You cannot refer to it as data. If you refer to it as data, it won't know what you're talking about. So very important. By the way, you can send as many key value pairs as you want to your HTML file, and you often will. You just have to separate the key value pairs with commas. So here's an example. Suppose we have an HTML template, okay? And suppose we send that item, the dictionary that I showed you a few minutes ago, to the template. The template itself is on the left side, and you'll notice that there are variables here. Item, if you remember, that is the name. That's the key that we had in the dictionary, and that's how we have to refer to it. But item is a product object, so it contains all of the columns that are in the product object, including the description and the unit cost and the unit price rather, the quantity. We can access all of that information now by simply using the item object. So item.description will generate the description of the item. That is the one that has an ID of 1. Item.description with a bar here in title is something that is provided in the Django template language. I'll talk about that in just a second. But you'll notice that the variables here will all be printed out. This is a typo, by the way. This should not be product. This should be item. Okay, so that's a mistake. So make sure you fix that. That is actually supposed to be item, not product. The float format is a really nice, it's called a filter. And what it does is it automatically formats something to two decimal places. So that's a really nice thing to know. The title does title case, so it will capitalize each word in the title, which is also very nice. On the right here, you'll see how the browser would actually, if you looked at the view source in the browser, this is what it would look like. Notice that the title here, you can use the title in the head section. But let's suppose in the database it was stored as lowercase letters, it would be displayed then as lowercase letters. But because we use the title filter, it will actually make Sherlock Holmes here, the first letter is capitalized. It will round the price. It probably was already rounded to two decimal places. But just in case, we'll round that to two decimal places. And you'll notice that this is dynamic. Now, if we went out to the view and we changed the ID to a different number, this, of course, would change completely. Okay, very important down here at the bottom. The template refers to the key name within the dictionary. That is item, not the name of the dictionary. That is data. It's a common mistake when you're first using Django templates, so make sure you don't do that. Again, this is a mistake. This should not be product. This should be item. Let's take another example. Commonly, you'll go out to a database and you'll get all of the products, for example, or all of the items in a table. So let's take this as an example. Let's suppose we have to get products, plural, and we're going to get all the products. Now here's the interesting thing. When you get products, you're actually getting a list of products. You're getting not just one object, but you're getting lots of objects. If you have 100 items in your database, your list contains 100 objects. So how do you handle that? Well, the process is pretty much the same. You're going to load up a data dictionary, and I always use, if I have a list, I always use plural to indicate that list. So I have items now, and I have products here. And again, format's the same, not much different. But here's the problem. If we do this, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to display these, but we're not actually displaying just a single item. We're displaying a list of items. Now, you can use the approach we've been using up till now, and that is you can just print the items using the magic method. And this is what the template would look like. You can surround it with a paragraph, and then you can put items as a variable, and it would just simply print all the items. The problem is that magic method format, it's pretty ugly. I mean, it puts query set in front of it and brackets, and it just really doesn't look professional. It looks really kind of awkward. And so we want to make sure that we're cleaning this up. Again, it will use, it's very useful for debugging and development as you're just playing around with it. But eventually you're going to want something a little more sophisticated. Now the DTL has a structure for that. It's a for loop. And what you can do is, and again, this is very similar to Python, except for the curly braces and the parentheses around, or the percentage symbols. This largely is Python. I want to point out one thing, by the way, is that students, will sometimes put spaces between the curly brace and the percentage symbol, either over here or over here. It will not work if you do that, okay? So make sure you get the syntax exactly right. Use spaces where you're supposed to, but don't put them in where you're not. Again, this is items here is the item that was passed. So you'll notice if we go back to this is the key, was called items. So that's how we have to refer to it in the template. You can iterate across the items by saying for item in items. Now item will be instantiated to each item in the list of items as it goes through the loop. The paragraph symbol, now we can refer to item, description with the title filter, that'll capitalize the first letters. Costs, we can put a $ in front. Item, unit price, and we use float format to round to 2, and this will generate and it'll iterate over the list. If we have 100 items in our database, 100 products, it will generate 100 paragraphs. How many ever items we have in our database, that's how many paragraphs will be generated. Now, another approach you could use with a for loop is you could use an unordered list. So for an unordered list, you could create a UL, and then you could iterate using the structure that I showed you a minute ago. But if you remember from our talk about HTML, the list elements inside that are going to be, each item is going to be surrounded by a list item. And that's what's going to generate what commonly is generated as a series of bullet points. So with a UL and a closing UL, we only want one of those because there's only going to be one unordered list. But with LI, we want the LI to be surrounded by each item in the list. So if we have 100 items, we want 100 LIs. But we only want one UL and closing UL. Now, the other thing you can do, there's another structure that is very commonly used within Django template language, and that is the if statements. Don't use it as much as for loops, but at the same time, it can be really, really helpful. Now, this code's a little more involved, but it's not really that complicated. You just have to stay with me on this, and I think you'll understand it. We want, again, one UL, which is going to be an unordered list. We want a closing UL, which of course actually closes the list. And then we want a for loop. I want to also note that it is very important that you close your loops, by the way. If you don't close your loops with an end for, it will generate an error, okay? So let's go back to this. We have a for loop for item in items, and this is going to end here. Now, what we're doing is we're going to print out each element in our database. In each element, we're going to have an LI. We're going to print the description. I skipped the title filter here, but we're going to have an item description. And then we're simply going to print the words quantity on hand. Now, the thing is, we got two situations. Suppose if we have items in stock, we want to print that. But if an item is out of stock, we want to print the words out of stock. Now, this is inside an LI, and this is the closing LI. So if an item quantity is greater than 0, we're going to print the quantity. Otherwise, we're going to print out of stock. So this is really cool because this creates this dynamic message. It doesn't just print 0, it says out of stock. And this is another way that you can use DTL. Again, not that complicated, but it's really powerful because it creates a much more professional looking website than just simply printing out 0 as an example. So in conclusion, I mean, the previous slide is about as complicated as you should get with DTL. I mean, honestly, you don't want to get too crazy with it, but it's probably most useful for printing out lists of items. You will, of course, also use the variables a lot. Again, remember putting spaces on either side of the variable names. I want to put in a plug for the Django project website. Really, you should go out and take a look because there are some amazing things out there, for example, that you can do with DTL. It really is a very powerful language, and a lot of the features are hidden, but if you do a little searching out there, you'll find it, and I'm sure you'll be able to find some really cool things you can do with your web page. I hope this helps. Take care.